Please take your Bibles and turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. We're going to be looking at verses 24 to 27 this morning. This is the second of a two-part series here that actually is following up on Grant Clay's message on the Great Commission 2 weeks ago. So if you can figure all of that out, this is really the application of our responsibility to live, as we just sang, with Jesus as our life. He is everything to us, and we belong to Him, and we do what He says and go where He tells us to go. Well, you know this, the Bible uses a number of metaphors to describe the Christian life, and one of the most common, at least in the New Testament, is a race. The way we respond to God's particular call upon our lives, the way we prepare to be used by Him, and the manner in which we actually execute that ministry, we carry it out, is comparable in the New Testament to a long-distance foot race. And that's what this passage is about this morning. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9, beginning in verse 24, "Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Now, you run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like a man running aimlessly. I do not fight like a man beating the air. No, I beat my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize." Now, you may know that 1 Corinthians 9 is more or less Paul's explanation of his motives and his methods for ministry. He was assigned by Jesus to preach the gospel, particularly in areas, places where it had never been preached before. His motive was to please the Lord and to be faithful to that assignment. His method was to make sure that he did not get in the way. And in order to do this most effectively, Paul had to practice self-denial and self-discipline in the same kind of way that a serious runner has to practice self-denial and self-discipline when preparing for and then running a long-distance foot race. Early in chapter 9, Paul tells us that he voluntarily gave up many of his legitimate rights and privileges and liberties so that nothing would hinder the spread of the gospel. And then he says that he was careful to adapt to the customs and the cultures of the people and places he went in order to give those people the best opportunity to authentically encounter Jesus and respond to Him. In other words, Paul made sure that he did not get in the way. He didn't want his own preferences, his own mannerisms, or his personal rights and freedoms to distract from the message or from the one he represented. But Paul in 1 Corinthians 9 is not just giving a personal testimony about how he practiced self-denial and self-discipline. He is instructing us to practice it as well so that we can be effective ministers as well. We must, he says, stay mentally and spiritually alert and focused. We must not allow anything to divert us from the assignment God has given us. We must also be willing to do whatever it takes to not let our own personal preferences and mannerisms and rights prevent us from being maximally effective as a servant of Christ. And we're going to look at the passage here and see how he develops that theme. Look again at verse 24. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Now, the ancient Greeks had two great athletic festivals. You're familiar with the Olympics. That was back then. But the second one was the Isthmian Games. The Isthmian Games were always held in Corinth because it was located on an isthmus. Those are hard words to say, by the way, Isthmian. And it occurred every 2 years, every other year. Therefore, the recipients of Paul's letter here would have been intimately acquainted with this metaphor of a race. They would have known, for example, that it was the common practice for the contestants to train rigorously for 10 months prior to the competition. And they would have been able to observe at least part of the training, because no matter what part of the Roman Empire these athletes came from, the last month of training was always spent in Corinth with supervised daily workouts in a gymnasium or on the track. The Corinthians knew that the games held in their city were taken very seriously by these athletes. Participation in these games was not a pastime or a hobby or a means to merely stay in shape or burn off some excess calories. No, running was their life. And so all of their focus, all of their time and attention and energy were directed toward competing in the race. And when the race began, they all had the same goal. They wanted to win. Paul, in asking this rhetorical question in verse 24, is saying, you people know what it takes to win. You've seen these athletes train with your own eyes. You've seen them practice self-denial and self-discipline. That's precisely the way that I approach my ministry assignment from the Lord. And that is what you must do as well. Look at what he says. Run in such a way as to get the prize. By the way, Paul is not saying that Christians should compete against each other to see who gets the prize for being the most spiritual, or see who can win the most people to the Lord, or see who can get the most rewards when we get to heaven. No, he's saying that our God-given task is so important, we must perform it with the same kind of focus, effort, and intensity that a serious runner has when competing in an important race. And that means simply going all out, all the way to the finish line, hurdling any obstacle along the way, and not letting anything distract or divert us from that goal. Brothers and sisters, we have all been given a specific assignment from the Lord. Earlier in the chapter, Paul identified his own assignment as preaching the gospel. And he said, I'm compelled to preach. Woe be to me if I do not preach the gospel. Then he went on to say that he ordered his life around that calling so that he could be most effective. Preaching the gospel was his main priority, and everything else took a back seat, including his own personal comfort, ambitions, rights, freedoms. The same is true for us. Each of us has a specific calling from the Lord. Some of us are called to serve behind the scenes. Some of us are called to be encouragers or to give our resources for God's work, or to shepherd God's people, or to administer, or to teach. Some of us are called to come alongside those who are hurting. Whatever our specific assignment from the Lord, He wants and expects that we engage in that assignment with all of our hearts and with all of our strength. To be focused, to be faithful. And if we are going to do that, says Paul, then we need, just like an athlete, to practice self-denial and self-discipline. Look at verse 25. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. Now, I told you about the 10 months of rigorous training just prior to the games. Even back in these days, there was a science to maximizing one's effectiveness or one's performance on the track. What or what not to eat and drink, when and how much to eat and drink, what kind of weightlifting routine one should or should not do, how and when and at what rate one should increase the distance of the run during the race, when to accelerate during the race, when to conserve energy during the race, on and on. But I think you know that what makes an excellent runner is not merely the performance techniques that he or she uses. It's actually the dedication and the discipline that he or she possesses. My goodness, he's out the door when everybody else has hit the snooze button. She's running on that track in the dark, rain or shine. And they do it even when they don't feel like it. Even when they would rather be doing something else. Even when it doesn't feel like they're making any improvements or progress. And that same kind of discipline and dedication is needed in order to be effective in our ministries as well. Whether it be shepherding, encouraging, exhorting, serving, giving, leading, administrating, evangelizing, whatever it is, God insists that we be faithful in what He's called us to do and that we persevere in it, whether we feel like it or not, whether it's convenient or not, whether it's appreciated or not, whether we see results or not. You know this, that serving the Lord is not always a walk in the park. Just like training for a race is not always easy or fun or pleasurable. Sometimes it's exhausting. Sometimes it's heartbreaking. Sometimes it seems like all your labor is in vain. But that's where discipline comes in. Because we have to consciously remind ourselves that our service for the Lord is never about us and how we feel, what we get out of it. It's about Him, what He wants to do through us, what He chooses to do through us. And so I believe the strict training in verse 25 is a reference to the discipline that is required to keep pressing on, staying the course, running hard all the way to the end. It's the discipline in Paul's words to the Philippians to forget what is behind and strain toward what is ahead, pressing on to win the prize for which God has called us heavenward in Christ Jesus. It's the discipline, according to Hebrews, to keep our eyes on Jesus during the race, not focus on our circumstances or our stress, not to focus on our discomfort or on what other people think. It's the discipline to be vigilant, so that we are not blindsided by the attacks of the evil one. It's the discipline to not become resentful when people hurt us or become disillusioned when they disappoint us. You know, you cannot read 1st and 2nd Corinthians without realizing that it was this kind of discipline that Paul had in mind when he talked about his own calling to be an apostle and preach the gospel to the Gentiles. Have you ever noticed in reading 1st and 2nd Corinthians how often Paul addressed their criticism of him? The Corinthian church was constantly criticizing and disparaging Paul's leadership and ministry, even after proving himself and his integrity, his faithfulness. They kept jumping to conclusions and making assumptions, comparing him with other leaders in the church, and he always came out on the short end, it seems. You know, Paul was hurt by their immaturity and their carnal attitudes. But he kept on loving them. He kept on pursuing them and serving them and shepherding them and instructing them, even when his own efforts were rebuffed. And that required discipline. Discipline to not let his heart become hard toward them. Discipline to not let his own emotions determine his level of commitment. Discipline to fix his eyes on Jesus and remember that the only thing that really matters is what he thinks and what he wants, and that the only reward worth working for is the reward that comes when he finishes the race. Look at what Paul said at the end of verse 25. They, this is the runners now, do it, they run their races to get a crown that will not last. But we do it to get a crown that will last forever. You know, I admire the athletes who compete in the Olympics. I am inspired by them, but I cannot really understand them. Because, you know, here's an individual who has devoted almost every waking hour of his or her life, who's produced more sweat, endured more pain, experienced more exhaustion, risked more injury than I will ever know. For what? For the slight possibility that he or she might be recognized as the best in the world? For the slight possibility that he or she might receive a medal that will eventually tarnish? By the way, it's interesting. You know, in the Isthmian Games, the reward they got was a crown of laurel. My word, it withers after just a few days. I can't relate. I mean, the potential for the reward is too small. The reward itself is too insignificant. But I want to tell you it's different in the spiritual realm. What sets Christian endeavor apart from athletic endeavor is not the way we approach our work, but the quality and certainty of the reward we receive from it. We are working toward a goal and for a reward that does not tarnish or wither or fade. And I believe the crown that Paul is referring to is Jesus' pleasure and Jesus' glory. The prize is hearing him say to us, "Well done, my good and faithful servant." There cannot possibly be anything more satisfying, more rewarding than hearing those words. And that's why Paul would say in verse 26, "Therefore I do not run like a man running aimlessly. I do not fight like a man beating the air." During a race, a runner may be aware that his loved ones are in the stands cheering him on. But he doesn't exit the track to go talk to them. Nor does he pull out his smartphone during the race and check his emails or make some calls. And nor does he make a quick stop at the snack bar to grab some refreshments. No, he's focused on one thing: getting across that finish line before everyone else. So Paul says, I do not run like a man running aimlessly. I'm focused. I'm resolute. I'm determined to stay the course and run hard all the way to the finish line. And I'm not going to let discouragement or fatigue or criticism or anything else slow me down. Likewise, Paul says, I do not fight like a man beating the air. Paul is referring to something we call shadow boxing, something that a boxer does. Part of his training, they practice their jabs and their hooks and uppercuts and combinations and flurries. But they don't have an opponent. They're literally beating the air. Shadow boxing is part of a boxer's training regimen. Muhammad Ali, for example, would shadow box for 45 minutes a day as part of his daily workouts in order to sharpen his footwork and increase his stamina. And it was very entertaining to watch him. But if that's all he did, he would be ill-prepared for any bout, because one of the primary ways that you prepare for a bout is by being punched and pummeled in order to toughen up your body so that it can withstand your opponent's blows. Which is why Paul would say in verse 27, I beat my body, make it my slave. I remember when Ali was preparing to fight George Foreman for the World Heavyweight Championship. He spent an extraordinary amount of time letting his sparring partner pummel his midsection. That's because Foreman was known for his power. He would often wear out his opponents by relentlessly assaulting their midsection. So when Ali and Foreman met in the famous Rumble in the Jungle, sure enough, Foreman spent the first 7 rounds pummeling Ali's abdomen, and Ali let him do it. And it appeared like he was doomed to be defeated. But as Ali expected, Foreman wore himself out by delivering those punches. And in the 8th round, Ali, sensing Foreman's fatigue, came to life and knocked him out. That was the result of his training. Beating his body, making it his slave. And that is precisely what Paul is talking about here. Because in ministry, don't forget, we are dealing with an opponent that is powerful and relentless. He knows our vulnerabilities. He will mercilessly attack those vulnerabilities at the very minimum to try to knock the wind out of us, but he's going to really try to knock us down or knock us out. He definitely wants to disable us. By the way, in preparing to go to Africa, I know this is a subjective interpretation. You can't believe all of the opposition. George Maguro's wife is unable to go as of Friday. I just heard from Debbie, Charles Juma's mother is in critical condition in the hospital. There's all kinds of things. I don't know if all of it seems to not be coincidence, though. Many things in our own lives. Listen, before Paul engaged in ministry, like preaching the gospel, he prepared for those assaults and attacks so that while he was doing that ministry, he could withstand the inevitable blows, and so that at the appropriate time, he himself could deliver the knockout punch so that the gospel would advance. Paul said in another place, we're not going to let Satan outwit us because we're not unaware of his scheme. Paul says in verse 27, I beat my body and make it my slave so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. Let me ask you a question. Those of you who are reasonably healthy and are 65 years of age or younger, do you think you could run a marathon? I bet you could. I know I could. And I don't even like to run. I'm confident that I won't. But I could. And do you know why most of us, including myself, will never run a marathon? It's not that we are incapable of doing it. It's that we lack the will and the discipline to do it. For me, the reward of running is not worth the price I'd have to pay to prepare for it. The sacrifice, the self-denial, the exhaustion, the pain, the discomfort. That's why I played baseball. Seriously, when I was in high school, during baseball practice, I used to watch the track guys run by and think to myself, wow, I'm so glad I'm not them. Many people are slaves to their bodies. Their bodies tell their minds and spirits what to do. That's not true of a serious runner, though. He tells his body what to do. He runs when he would rather be resting. He eats a balanced meal when he would rather have a milkshake. He goes to bed when he would rather stay up. He gets up early when he'd rather stay in bed. An athlete leads his body. He doesn't follow it. His body is his slave. And Paul said it's the same when it comes to ministry. We don't just do what we want to do. We do what God has called us to do. Because if we don't do what God has called us to do, then God's work through us won't be done. God's kingdom will not advance in the way He wants it to. God will not be pleased. That's what Paul means when he says, so I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. I think Paul here is alluding to something that all of the Corinthians knew about. I told you about the training regiment that an athlete went through to be part of the Isthmian Games. That training regiment was not optional. It was mandatory. And before a competition, every athlete had to show proof that he had met those training requirements. And if he failed to meet those requirements, he was disqualified. He couldn't even run, much less win. It was a serious matter to follow the rules when training for the Isthmian Games. How much more serious when the stakes are so much higher in the spiritual realm? We've been looking at a metaphor this morning. Paul has been comparing ministry to a marathon. The way we respond to God's particular call upon our lives, the way we prepare to be used by Him, the manner in which we execute our ministry is comparable to a long-distance foot race. I just want to remind you, each of us who belong to Jesus has been called by Him to serve in some way. He's given each of us a specific task. And so I have two questions for you by way of application here. Do you know what your specific assignment is? If not, I just want to encourage you. It's very important for you to find that out, because God wants to use you. If you don't know what your particular assignment is, I would begin by starting to ask the Lord. It's not something He wants to hide from you. So ask Him, and then ask people you trust who know you. Maybe the leadership in the church, maybe some good friends. Second, if you do know your assignment, are you doing it with all your heart and with all your strength? It's easy to default into half-heartedness. It's easy to default into distraction. because of discouragement or laziness or something else. I told you a few minutes ago that I will never run a marathon, and I don't feel the slightest bit of guilt over that, because running a marathon is optional. But my assignment from the Lord is not optional, and neither is yours. When God gives us talents, He expects us to use them for Him. And when we do, not only is He pleased, He will reward us